Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. The new curtains have the deep, rich color of ripe plums, and their Italian velvet nap catches and holds the late afternoon light, transforming St. Mary's humble town hall into something approaching theatrical grandeur. Mrs. Beatrice Lyle, chairwoman of the Village Improvement Committee, evaluated them beside the satisfied air of a general who had reviewed successful combat preparations. "They do lend the place a certain dignity," she told the assembled audience, her voice bearing that distinct note of victory reserved for those who have successfully navigated the dangerous waters of village politics and emerged victorious. "Mrs. Fora's generosity has greatly improved our little hall." Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her usual third-row seat with her knitting bag at her feet, gave a gentle grin of appreciation as her keen blue eyes took thorough inventory of the scene before her. The drapes were gorgeous, considerably more impressive than anything the village hall had before displayed, but it was not their beauty that drew her in. Rather, she found herself examining the brass fittings, the way the cloth hung, and most importantly, the condition of the tiebacks and their associated tassels. The summer recital had gathered the usual crowd of village dignitaries and social climbers. Colonel Geoffrey Hart sat ramrod straight in the front row, his military attitude intact despite his 70-odd years, while his much younger wife, Olivia, fidgeted beside him in a way that suggested her mind were elsewhere entirely. Dr. Peter Redfern had claimed a seat near the rear, purportedly to enable for a speedy exit in the event of a medical emergency. But Miss Marple saw his attention was drawn to Mrs. Hart, rather than possible patients. Mrs. Lyle proceeded, consulting her notes with the seriousness of a High Court judge. "We begin with our brilliant young people reciting pastoral poet selections, followed by Miss Bell's piano concert, and conclude with the ceremonial unveiling of our beautiful new curtains," which Mrs. Millicent Forrester generously gave. Mrs. Forrester, resplendent in midnight blue silk, bent her head regally from her seat in the second row, eliciting a murmur of polite approval from the crowd. She was a gorgeous woman in her 50s, with a demeanor that suggested she had never forgotten her late husband's enormous income, nor forgiven those who had earlier looked down on her more humble background. Mr. Lionel Creswell, the village's antique dealer and self-proclaimed aesthetic expert, had proudly positioned himself near the curtain mechanism. His part in obtaining the brass fittings and supervising the installation had briefly lifted him to the rank of local celebrity, which he clearly enjoyed. "Finest Italian velvet," he mumbled to anybody within earshot, his voice bearing the respectful tone typically reserved for religious observations. "The weight alone speaks to quality, and the brasswork is genuine Victorian, recovered from a manor house in Devon. Just the best for St. Mary me." Miss Marple's needles clicked lightly as she stitched a particularly elaborate pattern, but her focus was concentrated on the subtle dynamics unfolding before her. Mrs. Fora's eyes kept moving to the draperies, her demeanor appearing less proprietary than concerned. She noticed as young Julian Timain, the village's self-proclaimed cultural director, stood near the platform with hardly veiled anxiousness, checking and rechecking his notes. The evening went according to plan. The children delivered their verses with heartfelt sincerity, tripping only infrequently over the most ambitious analogies. Miss Bell's piano performance demonstrated competent technique, albeit not inspired artistry. The comedic interlude with a vegetable confusion elicited the anticipated giggles from an audience eager to be delighted. Throughout, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to minor facts that others seemed to overlook. She saw that the left-hand tie-back had been retied since the afternoon practice, no longer in the perfect bow she had seen previously, but in a more utilitarian knot that spoke of haste rather than ceremony. A single pale thread, barely visible against the dark velvet, clung to the tassel. Most tellingly, she noticed how several members of the audience appeared hesitant to stare directly at the curtains, as if the sight itself made them uncomfortable. "And now," announced Mrs. Lyle, her voice rising with ceremonial gravity, "the moment we'd all been waiting for. The formal unveiling of our magnificent new curtains, generously donated by Mrs. Millicent Forrester of Orchard House." The applause was strong, albeit somewhat perfunctory. Mrs. Forrester rose to receive the recognition, but Miss Marple noted that her smile was strained. Mr. Creswell assumed his position at the curtain cord with a theatrical flourish, while Mrs. Lyle wielded a small pair of ceremonial scissors toward a ribbon that had been attached to the stage for the occasion. Mrs. Lyle declared on the count of 3, raising the scissors as if they were a sword. 1, 2, and 3. The ribbon slid away with a gratifying snip. Mr. Creswell pulled the cord with confidence and authority. For a moment, nothing happened. The curtains remained stubbornly closed, as if unwilling to reveal what lay behind them. A nervous titter spread throughout the audience. Mr. Creswell tugged harder, his face contorted with struggle and embarrassment. The left curtain shifted slightly, then more, until both sides swept apart with a heavy, hesitant motion that appeared almost alive. The collective gasp from the audience was sharp and immediate. Julian Tremaine sat center stage in a high-back chair, his head lulled at an unnatural angle, his hands slack in his lap, and his usually animated features frozen in a permanent expression of surprise. Miss Marple's knitting needles remained still as she examined the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had seen death in many forms. The young man's skew collar, the peculiar flatness of his complexion against the rich velvet backdrop, and the subtle but unmistakable signs that life had passed all pointed to violence rather than natural causes. "Good heavens," breathed Dr. Redfern, already rising from his seat and moving toward the stage. His medical training had recognized what others were still struggling to comprehend. Mrs. Lyle's hand flew to her throat, her face cycling through expressions of confusion, horror, and dawning realization. "Julian?" she called weakly, as if hoping this might prove some elaborate theatrical gesture gone wrong. But Miss Marple, her sharp eyes having caught the glint of something thin and metallic around the young man's throat, partially concealed by his collar, knew better. She also noticed, with the attention to domestic detail that had served her well over the years, that the pale thread she had observed on the tassel was not, as she had first assumed, a bit of stray wool, but rather a fiber that matched exactly the blue cardigan worn by one particular member of their audience. "Close the curtains," someone whispered urgently, but no one moved to comply. The magnificent velvet panels hung open like theatre curtains, framing a tragedy, while death sat center stage in their grand debut. Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and placed it in her bag. In her considerable experience, murder, for murder this surely was, rarely occurred without substantial preparation and compelling motive. The curtains, she reflected, had indeed hidden something significant. The question now was not what they had concealed, but who had arranged for that concealment and why. The peaceful evening in St. Mary Me had ended with deadly drama, and Miss Marple suspected the final act was yet to come. The velvet curtains hung open like theatre drapes framing a macabre final act, and for several long moments the audience sat frozen in their seats, as if movement itself might somehow make the impossible scene more real. Dr. Redfern's brisk examination confirmed what the unnatural angle of Julian Tremaine's head had already suggested. The young man was quite dead and not from natural causes. The thin mark around his throat, partially concealed by his collar, spoke of strangulation with something narrow and strong. "Someone telephone the police immediately, Doctor," Redfern commanded, his medical authority cutting through the shocked murmurs. "And please no one touch anything near the stage." Mrs. Lyle, still clutching the ceremonial scissors, swayed dangerously until Mr. Creswell steadied her elbow. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple that the very curtains meant to bring dignity to their modest hall had instead provided the backdrop for St. Mary Me's first murder in living memory. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the evening. Quiet, but the damage to village tranquility had already been done. As Sergeant Plum and his constables secured the scene, the stunned audience filed out into the gathering dusk, their whispers held in check only until they crossed the threshold onto the village green. Then, like water through a broken dam, the speculation began to flow. The gossip mill turns. By the following morning, 3 different versions of events had made their rounds through St. Mary Me's informal but highly efficient information network. At Green's grocery, Mrs. Finch held court among the vegetables, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been present at the discovery. "Unnatural, that's what it was," she declared, examining a particularly fine apple, with the same intensity she applied to village mysteries. He was alive at the afternoon rehearsal. I saw him myself, fussing over every detail. Meticulous he was, but fussiness makes enemies, mark my words. Mr. Creswell, who had arrived ostensibly to purchase lemons, but clearly to defend his installation work, bristled at any suggestion of mechanical failure. The curtain mechanism was perfect, he insisted. Any delay in the drawer was purely atmospheric, moisture in the air. Nothing wrong with my fittings, finest vintage brass. But who mentioned wire? Mrs. Finch pounced on his nervous elaboration. You said wire, Mr. Creswell. I most certainly did not, he retorted, then added unwisely, though if anyone had used such a thing, well, I never keep dangerous materials near the stage, told them so repeatedly. The suggestion of wire spread through the queue like spilled honey, sweet and sticky with implication. Mrs. Emmeline Price, whose perpetual morning dress lent gravity to her pronouncements, nodded sagely. It's always money, she declared. Julian had a way of promising what he couldn't deliver. Culture costs and someone must pay. Generosity breeds resentment, and Mrs. Forrester has been most generous indeed. Secrets in plain sight. Miss Marple, who had come for tea and lemons but stayed for enlightenment, listened with the gentle attention that encouraged confidences. She noted how Mrs. Forres's name seemed to tighten certain faces, how mentions of money made others shift uncomfortably. At the post office, Mrs. Hart stood at the counter with trembling hands, her dove-grey ensemble completed by a silk scarf wound carefully about her throat. Really, Mr. Pithrick, she was saying, yesterday's post was light. If my parcel isn't here today, surely it will arrive tomorrow. The postmaster's patience wore thin under pressure. One cannot conjure parcels, Mrs. Hart, however much one might wish. She turned flustered, nearly colliding with Miss Marple. Oh, Jane, Miss Marple, such a terrible business. The Colonel is beside himself. To think such a thing could happen in our village. Miss Marple murmured appropriate sympathies while observing that Mrs. Hart's scarf was both practical and becoming. So thoughtful to carry something against drafts, she noted mildly. Mrs. Hart's hand flew to her throat. The hall is always cold, she said quickly. One never thinks velvet will feel like stone. Behind them, Miss Bell slipped in quietly, her cream cardigan, not the pale blue she had worn the previous evening, buttoned high at the neck. Artists burn themselves out, she murmured to no one in particular. It would be too awful if it were otherwise. Financial threads. The most intriguing intelligence came from Mrs. Patience, Crump, the postmistress, who revealed that Julian had recently received several mysterious letters. Official-looking envelopes, she confided, clearly relishing her moment of importance, at least one from London, Pembroke, Hartwell and Associates, if memory serves. A law firm. This revelation sent fresh ripples through the village consciousness. Law firms suggested inheritance, debt or legal disputes, any of which might provide compelling motives for murder. Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Forrester had grown noticeably pale at the mention of London lawyers. The financial theme gained strength. When young Timothy Bell mentioned seeing Julian in heated discussion with someone behind the stage during the afternoon rehearsal. Just after 4, he specified. Julian kept shushing whoever it was, said they were disrupting the acoustics. Mr. Bantry, who had appointed himself unofficial investigator, seized upon this detail, hardly surprising considering his recent difficulties with the Village Improvement Committee. That unfortunate business about the missing funds from the Spring Festival. Missing funds? Mrs. Ly's voice rose sharply. Julian's accounts were perfectly in order when last reviewed, but the seed was planted. By afternoon, the missing funds had grown from minor discrepancy to substantial embezzlement in the collective village imagination, military precision and civilian secrets. Colonel Hart's reaction to the tragedy proved particularly revealing. Rather than horror, he displayed the peculiar species of male indignation that feels personally insulted by public disaster. His words, the previous afternoon, not a penny for friaries while the pavilion roof leaks now carried ominous weight. Julian was always poking his nose where it didn't belong, the Colonel declared to anyone who would listen. Too keen on controlling things, if you ask me. Dr. Red Fern, walking past the Rose and Crown with his medical bag and visible tension in his jaw, pointedly avoided joining the speculation. His professional discretion spoke volumes about what he might have observed during his examination of the body. The pattern emerges through it all. Miss Marple maintained her gentle errands, calling on Mrs. Forrester at Orchard House. She found her hostess rather too insistent that the curtains had been a long-planned indulgence, quite within my means, and that she could think of no reason whatsoever anyone might wish to harm poor Julian. No reason at all, Miss Marple echoed, watching as Mrs. Forres's eyes slid toward a large ledger on her escar before snapping it shut with forced brightness. Walking home by the lane behind the village hall, Miss Marple paused to observe the stage through a gap in the curtains. The left tie-back still hung in that practical knot she had noticed, so unlike Mr. Creswell's meticulous arrangements, a fine filament, almost invisible unless one knew to look, caught the slanting sunlight before disappearing when clouds passed overhead. The village had done what villagers do, explained the world to itself through a swarm of reasonable and unreasonable theories. But beneath the surface chatter, Miss Marple detected the smaller notes, anxieties, omissions, the telltale awkwardness of those who look too much or not at all. People often put their secrets where they think no one will look, she reflected. Curtains, unfortunately for someone in St. Mary Me, encouraged that particular mistake. The morning brought Inspector Slack from much Bainom, his brisk efficiency, barely concealing his irritation at being summoned to what he clearly regarded as a provincial inconvenience. Miss Marple, taking her customary constitutional past the village hall, observed his arrival with the same quiet attention she applied to studying the habits of garden birds, noting patterns, cataloguing behaviors, and drawing conclusions that others might miss entirely. Straightforward enough, she heard him declare to Sergeant Plum through the open doorway. Robbery gone wrong, most likely. The victim's wallet was missing, after all. These artistic types often carry more cash than sense. Miss Marple continued her walk, but made a mental note to return when official attention had moved elsewhere. In her considerable experience, crime scenes revealed their most significant secrets, only to patient and unobserved study, much like shy flowers that bloomed only when no one was watching. That afternoon, armed with a jar of her prize-winning strawberry preserves and genuine concern for Mrs. Lyle's state of mind, Miss Marple found herself with legitimate reason to enter the hall. The police had finished their initial investigation, but yellow tape remained surrounded the stage area, like a theatrical prop itself. Ironic, given the circumstances. Inspector Slack seems quite certain it was robbery, Mrs. Lyle admitted, taking the preserves with appreciative hands that trembled only slightly. I'm not sure what anyone expects to find in poor Julian's pockets. He was constantly moaning about being low on finances. Miss Marple whispered appropriate sympathy as her eyes carried out their own careful inquiry. The curtains hung the same way they had the night before, their rich velvet folds catching the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. But it was not their beauty that drew her in today. Rather, she found herself examining the mechanics of their operation with the same intensity as if she were solving a particularly complex home conundrum. The brass fittings Mr. Creswell had installed were of high quality, with ornate scrollwork and hefty construction indicating their Victorian origins. Miss Marple did, however, notice inconsistencies indicating recent strange activity. The left-hand curtain showed traces of tension where it met the tie-back, not the gradual wear of everyday use, but the kind of tearing that occurs when cloth is forced hard against metal, with significant force. Mrs. Lyle was busy preparing tea, so Miss Marple took advantage of the opportunity for a closer study. The tie-back knot piqued her interest, since it was functional rather than decorative, done by someone who was more concerned with practical uses than aesthetics. More tellingly, entangled in the tassel's twisted silk threads was the pale fiber she had spotted the night before. Under better lighting, she could see it was wool, a soft, costly grade that indicated high-quality knitwear. "Mrs. Lyle," she asked softly, "can I bother you for a drink of water? The afternoon has becoming rather warm." Miss Marple moved with astonishing speed for her age, as her hostess retired to the small kitchen. Her investigation of the curtain mechanism found clear evidence of recent modification. Not simply the pulling required for normal operation, but the type of handling that indicated someone had tried the resistance, possibly several times. Most intriguingly, she observed a little dark smudge on the brass fitting, where something had been connected and then removed, leaving just faint scratches in the metal. The stage itself told its own story to those who could read it. The chalk mark at center stage remained, but the chair where Julian had been discovered was several inches off that mark. The scuff marks on the stage varnish, some old and some clearly new, formed a picture of recent activity. Light dancing scuffs near where the chair had been positioned suggested reflexive shifting, caused by duress rather than violent struggle. Miss Marple bent to investigate a piece of the stage floor that was clearly visible in the afternoon light. There, barely visible in the dust, were faint impressions of soft-soled shoes, indicating that someone had stood very close to the victim's chair and remained there long enough to leave clear evidence of their presence. Mrs. Lyle returned with refreshments and an updated report on the morning's police operations. Inspector Slack seemed very interested in yesterday's rehearsal, she said. Who was present, what time people arrived and left, and whether Julian was concerned about anything. And did he appear troubled? Miss Marple questioned, receiving her water with gratitude. Julian was always particular about details, but yesterday he appeared almost frantic, checking and rechecking the curtain timing, insisting on multiple lighting adjustments, and questioning whether the chair placement was optimal. Mrs. Lyle paused thoughtfully. He spent a lot of time behind the stage in the afternoon, and I believed he was organizing props. This information perfectly complemented Miss Marple's developing understanding of the case. Julian's behavior suggested he was aware of some significant event. It was unclear if he had anticipated danger or simply sought theatrical perfection, but his anxious energy indicated that he was under a lot of pressure. Mrs. Lyle went on to say that the inspector mentioned taking statements from everyone who attended, but I can't imagine what any of us saw. The curtains were closed throughout the performance, after all, but Miss Marple's reflection was exactly the point. The curtains had provided perfect concealment for whatever had happened behind them. The question was not whether someone had used the concealment, but rather who had both the opportunity and the specific knowledge required to exploit it. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple made one last observation that would prove critical. Despite careful police examination and Mr. Ponsonby's subsequent cleaning, she discovered several minuscule fragments of dark velvet near the edge of the stage, pieces that exactly matched the curtains, but with additional fibers visible on their reverse sides, where the fabric was less dense. One pale blue thread matched the wool she found in the tassel, and the other was a darker thread that appeared to be black or navy cotton. Two people had recently come into close contact with the curtains and stage area, two people in very different outfits, and presumably playing very different roles in the evening's tragic conclusion. Walking home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple's mind began to organize the various threads of evidence into patterns that would eventually reveal the truth. The murderer knew the layout of the hall, could predict when all attention would be diverted elsewhere, and was brave or desperate enough to commit the crime in plain sight. The missing wallet may have suggested robbery to Inspector Slack's practical mind, but Miss Marple had seen too many human dramas to accept such simple explanations. In her experience, when someone went to the trouble of staging a death behind theatrical curtains, the motivations were far more complex than simple theft. The real killer, she felt certain, would prove to be someone whose respectability was as carefully maintained as those beautiful velvet curtains, and whose secrets, like Julian T. Maine's body, had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be dramatically revealed. The pattern was beginning to emerge, as patterns always did, when one paid proper attention to the small details that others overlooked. Soon Miss Marple knew it would be time to draw back the curtains on the truth itself. Inspector Slack approached the Colonel Hart situation with the methodical satisfaction of a man who preferred his cases to present clear motives and obvious suspects. By the morning, following Miss Marple's quiet investigation of the hall, the inspector had assembled what he clearly regarded as a compelling case against St. Mary Me's most prominent military resident. The quarrel that sealed the colonel's fate as prime suspect had occurred barely a week before Julian's death. During what was supposed to be a routine village improvement committee meeting, the disagreement had escalated from professional differences to personal animosity, with the sort of explosive inevitability that characterized the Colonel's approach to most conflicts. Extravagant nonsense, the Colonel had declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, when Julian proposed an ambitious redecoration scheme for the hall's entrance. The plan involved imported Italian marble, avant-garde murals, and what the Colonel termed a chandelier that costs more than most people earn in a year. Julian, never one to retreat from intellectual combat, had fired back with equal vehemence. "Your idea of improvement, Colonel, seems limited to patching leaks and whitewashing walls. We're trying to bring culture to St. Mary, not turn it into a military barracks." The exchange had deteriorated rapidly from there. Mrs. Lyle recalled the scenario in dramatic detail, as if she had witnessed true drama, and how the Colonel's complexion had become an alarming shade of purple as he accused Julian of creative accounting with committee funds. Julian's remark, that if the Colonel contributed something other than bluster, he might comprehend the importance of aesthetic investment, caused the elder man to rush out of the hall with such fury that the windows rattled. "Mark my words," the Colonel was heard to mutter as he left. "That young man will find himself in serious trouble if he continues down this path." Inspector Slack, gathering these reports with apparent satisfaction, discovered further ammo in the Colonel's military experience and well-documented temperament. Hart stated to Sergeant Plum that men like him do not forget slights, and when they strike it is with accuracy. You are familiar with military training. They comprehend methods. The Colonel's opportunity appeared similarly obvious. Mr. Creswell acknowledged with apparent reluctance that Hart had come at the back of the hall on the afternoon of the concert, presumably looking for a screwdriver for pavilion repairs. Timothy Bell had seen him leave the side entrance around 4:30, his demeanor severe with what the child had taken as military purpose. When confronted at his home, Colonel Hart treated Inspector Slack with the same rigid courtesy that he would have shown an unwelcome but necessary inspection. Miss Marple, who had come with a modest bouquet and a mild concern for Mrs. Hart's anxiety, found herself witnessing an interrogation that revealed as much about the questioner as the questioned. "So you quarreled with the deceased," Slack said abruptly, holding his notebook like a sword. "I disagreed with his fiscal irresponsibility," the Colonel stated with military precision. "There's a distinction, Inspector, though perhaps not one apparent to civilian minds. The alibi was given like clockwork. The Colonel had met with Dr. Redfern from 4:30 to 5:45 to discuss pavilion repairs and the approaching parish council elections. He then returned home for dinner with his wife, followed by their precisely timed arrival at the hall at 7:15, where they enjoyed front-row seats for the whole performance. "Dozens of witnesses," the Colonel said with satisfaction, including Mrs. Price, who complimented us on our punctuality as we passed the chemist's shop. Miss Marple, observing this exchange with the same gentle attention she used to study garden birds, noticed several intriguing details. The carriage clock on the mantelpiece showed 20 minutes past 2, despite the fact that the church bells had just struck the half-hour, indicating a stopped clock, and Mrs. Hart had spoken of their departure time with suspicious precision. The Colonel's navy blazer, hanging on the coat tree, had a little pulled thread near the left cuff, the kind of catch that happens when fine wool meets coarser surfaces like brass fittings. Mrs. Hart provided another puzzle. Her distress appeared to be focused less on Julian's death than on her husband's possible involvement, and her hands trembled as she served tea with the nervous efficiency of someone who had practiced the routine. Miss Marple noticed a small competent repair where a run had been carefully mended in the silk scarf at her throat, which had been changed from pale blue to navy the night before. "Such a shock for everyone," Mrs. Hart whispered, her gaze avoiding direct contact. "Geoffrey maintains that Julian brought it on himself by investigating matters that were not his concern." This casual revelation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Julian had been investigating something, but what and for whom? However, Inspector Slack remained fixated on the obvious story. The Colonel's temper, public threats, and presence in the hall at the critical moment all pointed to a crime of passion carried out with military precision. The missing wallet suggested robbery, but Slack suspected Hart had taken it to conceal his true intentions. Walking home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple pondered the strange nature of obvious solutions. In her extensive experience, murder was rarely as simple as it appeared, especially when the suspect appeared eager to prove his innocence through detailed alibis and precise timing. The pale blue wool fiber in the curtain tassel piqued her interest, as did the practical knot, which suggested someone more comfortable with utilitarian applications than decorative arrangements. The colonel may have tied such a knot, but would he have taken care to remove all traces of his presence, except for that single telling fiber? More troubling was the cigarette stub she found behind the hall, a foreign brand that did not match the colonel's preferred pipe tobacco or the smoking habits of other obvious suspects. Someone else had been present during the crucial period, someone who had taken care to conceal their involvement while ensuring suspicion fell elsewhere. The real killer, Miss Marple suspected, was someone who understood the value of misdirection, someone clever enough to construct not just a murder, but a perfect frame for an innocent man, whose only crime had been losing his temper at precisely the wrong moment. The morning after Inspector Slack's confident pronouncement about Colonel Hart's guilt, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the village hall with the persistent curiosity of someone who had observed too many human dramas to accept convenient explanations. Armed with her small magnifying glass and the patient methodology that had served her well in countless domestic mysteries, she approached the scene with the same attention she might apply to diagnosing a problem in her rose garden. Mr. Butte Ponson, the caretaker, greeted her arrival with the wary politeness reserved for ladies who might notice dust where others would not. "I've brought back Mrs. Lyle's preserve jar," Miss Marple explained, offering the rinsed container with gentle courtesy. "And I wondered, pure curiosity, you understand, about maintaining velvet curtains. Such beautiful fabric has an unfortunate tendency to gather dust." Mr. Ponsonby brightened considerably at the opportunity to share his expertise. "Air and a light hand, Miss Marple. Not too much fussing. The police have asked them to stay as they are for now, but you can see well enough from here." Indeed, Miss Marple could see what mattered most. The left tie-back remained secured with that utilitarian knot she had first observed, a practical half-hitch, rather than the decorative bow one might expect in such elegant surroundings. "Did you arrange them yesterday afternoon?" she inquired mildly. "They looked quite lovely, I thought, rather like gifts waiting to be opened." "Fiving sharp," Mr. Ponson replied with evident pride. "Nice even bows, just as young Mr. Tremaine requested. Not a hair's breadth out of alignment, Ponimbe," he said. Particular about symmetry he was. Then I locked up until 7, seeing as Mrs. Lyle had the key for the evening. "Or the doors?" Miss Marple asked, with the casual interest of someone making conversation. "The front entrance, certainly. The side door?" "Well, Mr. Tremaine asked me to leave it on the latch. Said he might need to fetch some music from the vest room without bothering me further. He'd had me adjusting things quite enough for one day." Mr. Ponson's mouth tightened slightly at the memory of an afternoon spent accommodating artistic temperament. This information aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the evening's events. Someone had possessed both access and opportunity during the crucial period between 5 and 7s, when the hall stood officially locked, but practically accessible to anyone who understood the arrangements. From her position in the aisle, Miss Marple could observe the tassel where that pale blue fiber continued to cling like a whispered confession. Using her handkerchief and a small crochet hook from her knitting bag, she carefully teased the thread. Free, noting its fine quality and the way it had torn rather than simply caught evidence of contact under stress, rather than casual brushing. Under the hall's clear morning light, the fiber revealed itself as expensive wool with a soft bloom that good knitwear acquired through wear. It was a particular shade, not quite navy, not quite sky blue, but something distinctly in between that stirred a memory she could not quite place. Her next visit took her to Mr. Creswell's antique shop, where brass fittings and curiosities gleamed in the window display. The proprietor, eagerly polishing a candlestick, placed it aside with dramatic reluctance when Miss Marple noticed a set of curtain tiebacks similar to those in the hall. With reverence, he affirmed Victorian craftsmanship. If individuals understood appropriate technique, the knot would be half as beautiful. A bow for appearance, of course, but the actual security is in the slip knot beneath. Miss Marple kindly pointed out that the left tieback at the hall seems fairly businesslike in its arrangement. Mr. Creswell's expression hardened with professional wrath. Definitely not my work. I secured both with presentation bails at 5 wow, just as Mr. Ponsonby had confirmed. Whoever changed it afterwards realized the need of swift release. Some folks don't appreciate dramatic finishing touches. The confirmation lent credence to Miss Marple's evolving theory. "The left curtain seemed reluctant last evening," she remarked as you tried to draw it open. Indeed, he conceded regrettably that something had been stitched where it should not have been. Curtain cords must run freely in order to draw cleanly. Someone had tampered with the mechanism, so he flushed defensively. "Definitely not me." "Of course not," Miss Marple told him, with the empathy that comes from recognizing innocence without the need for sworn witness. "Do you use anything to assist the cables glide smoothly?" "A touch of beeswax comes naturally. Traditional procedure, but used sparingly, never enough to cause streaks. If you found wax residue, it was not from my upkeep." He ran nervous fingers through his hair before continuing, as if motivated by professional pride. There were scratches on the brass fittings where someone had attached and removed something quickly. What a pity. Quality brass remembers everything. Miss Marple walked home across the village green, reflecting on how brass remembered, just as velvet, silk, and the human heart did. The evidence presented a clear picture. Decorative bows were substituted with utilitarian knots, and access was gained through an unlocked side door. Preparation needed intimate knowledge of the hall's arrangement, as well as exact timing. As she passed the post office, she saw Miss Bell emerge with her music folio clasped protectively to her bosom. Despite the warmth of the morning, the pianist wore her cream cardigan, which she had worn the night before buttoned high. Miss Bell mumbled, "Such a terrible business," when Miss Marple offered mild condolences. "Everything feels so unsettled now." "Did you happen to return to the hall after yesterday's rehearsal?" Miss Marple inquired casually, as if she were having a conversation. Miss Bell responded after a scarcely discernible pause. "Only briefly, about 6 bow had I left my metronome on the ledge, and Mrs. Lyle is concerned about such things. I entered from the side and walked directly to the piano section." Miss Marple observed the accuracy of the timing and the meticulous specification of which entry had been utilized. "Your pale blue cardigan yesterday was such a lovely shade," she told me. "It suited you beautifully." Miss Bell responded suspiciously quickly, "I'm afraid I spilt tea on it." "It is currently drying at home." As they parted ways, Miss Marple noticed a slight linear indentation around the base of Miss Bell's right forefinger, similar to the mark left by a thin cord when tightly wrapped and tugged with force. Such marks might come from a variety of activities, but when paired with the other data, they indicated a more specialized application. Miss Marple's trained eye was able to discern the pattern. Someone had utilized the time between 5 and 7 to repair a mechanism that would operate precisely when everyone's attention was elsewhere. The changed knot, the impenetrable curtain, and the calculated delay all served to purchase precious seconds while masking the reality under luxurious velvet. The pale blue fiber had actually led her to comprehension, but as with many key clues, it revealed a much more nuanced story than surface appearances suggested. The fundamental question was not who had committed murder, but who had both the opportunity and the specific knowledge required to plan such a complex deceit. As Miss Marple approached her cottage, she mused on the mysterious nature of secrets and the extent individuals will go to keep them. Human nature, like curtains, frequently disguised as much as revealed, and the truth rested not in obvious solutions, but in the minor contradictions that close study could detect. The thread of truth, as fine as silk, was beginning to weave itself into a pattern that would eventually reveal the true murderer lying behind St. Mary Me's veneer of respectability. The afternoon light had that crystalline aspect that comes after rain, when everything gleams with new clarity and secrets seem more likely to emerge from their hiding places. Miss Marple, carrying a little basket with her prize-winning elderflower cordial, approached Orchard House with the steady speed of someone who knew that the most momentous revelations were frequently disguised as social calls. Mrs. Forrester greeted her in the morning room, where exquisite English damask curtains stood out against the theatrical velvet she had presented to the town hall. The tea service emerged with practiced efficiency, spouted china, perfectly warmed cups and little cakes placed with precision, indicating a household where looks were important. Miss Marple's experienced eye, however, spotted tiny indicators of strain behind the polished surface, such as a little tremble in her hostess's hands, the way conversation appeared to need evident effort, and most tellingly the ledger on the escritoire, which had been quickly covered with correspondence. "Such magnificent curtains you provided for the hall," Miss Marple began with gentle admiration, sliding into her chair with the ease of someone expecting a long visit. "Your gift has greatly impacted the village." Mrs. Forrest's grin was brittle, unlike in their previous encounters. "One does what one can for the community," she responded with careful modulation. "Harold always thought that affluence came with responsibilities, and I have attempted to uphold that idea since his death." The mention of her late husband opened conversational doors that Miss Marple entered with characteristic tact, noting how Mrs. Forrester's voice warmed genuinely when speaking of him, but also carried an undertone of anxiety. "The selection process must have been quite involved," she stated gently. "Such quality velvet requires considerable expertise." "Actually," Mrs. Forrester conceded with apparent hesitation, "Julian contributed significantly to the arrangements. He had contacts in London, including theatrical suppliers that could source suitable materials. I admit that I relied on his advice perhaps more than was prudent." This revelation caused a significant shift in Miss Marple's worldview. Julian's involvement in the curtain procurement implied a relationship that went far beyond a casual village acquaintance, and Mrs. Forrest's remorse hinted at long-standing issues. Miss Marple muttered encouragingly, her knitting needles clicking softly as she completed a particularly complex pattern. Mrs. Forrest's teacup rattled against its saucer as she pushed it down with undue force. Thoughtful, certainly, but Julian's assistance came with expectations that proved more harder to achieve. He had a knack of presenting prospects that appeared attractive at the moment, but turned out to be more expensive than expected. The venom behind these perfectly selected words hovered in the air like smoke from a poorly drawn chimney. Miss Marple waited with the patience that had served her well in countless such circumstances, knowing that secrets often surface when allowed enough silence to grow uncomfortable. Mrs. Forrester continued to express herself with startling vehemence. Julian had gotten more demanding in recent weeks. What began as helpful advice escalated into something resembling coercion. He identified several inconsistencies in Harold's business operations, which, while not criminal, may be unpleasant if exposed to public attention. The term blackmail went unspoken, but both women recognized its existence in the room. Miss Marple kept her knitting unaffected as her mind processed this critical information, realizing that Julian's murder was presenting itself as something far more sophisticated than thievery or crimes of passion. Mrs. Forrester spoke gently, her voice heavy with the weight of past humiliation. "The Forrester curtains were provided in remembrance of Harold. Then, 2 days before the recital, he warned me that emphasizing individual riches would be inappropriate and should instead be used to enhance village arts. To be told one's name diminishes charity." She laughed without humor. "Miss Marple, not all of our names have led to opportunities. It took me years to feel like I belonged in surroundings like these." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with a polite inquiry. "Such treatment must have been quite distressing. Have you discussed your worries with anyone? Can we talk about it?" Mrs. Forrest raised her voice slightly. "With whom?" Julian positioned himself as the Ville's cultural savior. Who would have thought that our artistic young man was capable of such deliberate manipulation? He mentioned spreading his activities into neighboring villages. Small communities appear to be particularly vulnerable to what he refers to as cultural pressure. The image that evolved was of a young man whose artistic pretensions disguised a calculating brain, bent on exploitation rather than creativity. Miss Marple took note of the plural word operations rather than operation, and stored it away with the expanding body of evidence that was transforming her perception of the case. She gently inquired the afternoon of the recital, "Did you happen to visit the hall?" Mrs. Forrester paused, her fingers caressing the lace edge of a handkerchief. "Bulldog and Fry sold me the strongest gauge of picture wire they had. The mirror in my back hall had been wobbling dangerously, and I decided it was prudent to address the issue. I took it to the hall that afternoon, intending to leave it with Mr. Ponson, but he was not available. I stored it in the vest room for safekeeping. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. The vest room led directly onto the stage area, and the strongest gauge picture wire would be used for purposes other than hanging mirrors. Did it remain there, do you think? Mrs. Forrester replied. I cannot say, but her eyes suggested she suspected otherwise. I forgot about it entirely until Inspector Slack mentioned that Julian had been strangled with something thin and strong. As Miss Marple was about to leave, Mrs. Forrester made one last revelation that would be critical to understanding the evening's events. Julian had asked me to arrive early that evening, around 6:30 instead of 7. He wanted to talk about what he called future arrangements before the performance began. Naturally, I refused. I had no intention of giving him another opportunity for private coercion. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on how Julian's planned meeting, the one that never occurred, might have provided someone else with both motive and opportunity. The picture wire, conveniently available in the vestry room, the unlocked side door, and the knowledge of Julian's habits all suggested a crime that had been carefully planned rather than impulsively executed. The threads of truth were weaving themselves into an increasingly clear pattern, and Miss Marple suspected that the final revelation would prove as dramatic as anything the village hall's magnificent curtains had been intended to frame. The evening light held that peculiar quality of late summer, when shadows lengthen with reluctance and secrets seem more likely to emerge from their carefully maintained hiding places. Miss Marple, walking home from Orchard House with Mrs. Forrester's revelations fresh in her mind, found herself drawn to make one additional call before darkness fell completely over St. Mary Me. Miss Bell's cottage sat behind a neat hedge of privet, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. The pianist answered her door with obvious reluctance, her cream cardigan buttoned high despite the evening's warmth, and her usual composed demeanor replaced by something approaching nervous exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she said with forced brightness, "how unexpected! I was just practicing for Sunday service." But the piano bench sat empty, and no sheet music lay open on the stand. Miss Marple noted these details with the same quiet attention she applied to observing the habits of garden birds, filing them away with a growing collection of small inconsistencies that painted a larger picture. "I hope I'm not intruding, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "I've been reflecting on our conversation yesterday, and I wondered, purely out of concern, you understand, whether you might have known Mr. T-Main better than most of us realized." The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Miss Bell's hands, Miss Marple observed, showed fresh signs of strain, a small bandage around her right index finger, and that telltale linear indentation that spoke of thin cord pulled tight under considerable pressure. "Julian was," Miss Bell began, then stopped, her composure cracking like ice under spring sun. "He was not the man the village believed him to be, Miss Marple. Not at all." The confession that followed emerged in fits and starts, like water from a damaged pipe. Julian had discovered irregularities in Miss Bell's teaching credentials, a reference that had been somewhat enhanced, a qualification that existed more in aspiration than in fact, small deceptions born of necessity, when her mother's illness had forced an abrupt departure from London, but deceptions nonetheless that could destroy a carefully rebuilt reputation. "He called them cultural investments," Miss Bell said bitterly, moving to her piano and running nervous fingers across the keys without producing sound. "Contributions to his artistic vision," he said, but they were nothing more than blackmail, dressed in pretty words and justified by grand theories about elevating provincial taste. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she absorbed this information. "And you paid him?" "What choice did I have?" The anguish in Miss Bell's voice was genuine and heartbreaking. "He demanded regular payments, increasing amounts as his projects grew more ambitious. Last week, he informed me that his operations were expanding to neighboring villages and that my initial investment would need to be substantially increased to ensure continued discretion." The picture that emerged was of a young man whose artistic pretensions master calculating intelligence focused on exploitation rather than creation. Miss Marple noted how Miss Bell's eyes kept drifting toward her music collection, as if something there held particular significance. "He kept records," Miss Bell admitted quietly, following Miss Marple's gaze, Detailed accounts of what he called his cultural partnerships, names, amounts, methods of persuasion, all hidden where no one would think to look, inside his sheet music between the pages of compositions he claimed to be studying. This revelation sent fresh understanding through Miss Marple's methodical mind. Julian's musical interests had provided perfect camouflage for his true activities, allowing him to maintain his facade, while documenting his victims' vulnerabilities with businesslike precision. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the village hall, where shouting voices suggested some new crisis had developed. Both women hurried toward the sound, arriving to find Dr. Redfern kneeling beside Mrs. Lyle, who sat on the hall steps, looking pale and shaken. Dreadful business. Mr. Ponson was explaining to a small crowd that had gathered. Mrs. Lyle was checking the flower arrangements when the whole curtain mechanism gave way. Missed her by inches. It did have been killed. The left curtain lay in a heap of rich velvet, its brass fittings scattered across the stage, like the remnants of some elaborate trap. The mounting hardware showed clear signs of recent tampering, not the gradual failure of normal wear, but the deliberate weakening that spoke of sabotage. Miss Marple examined the fallen assembly with characteristic thoroughness, noting the fresh scratches on the brass where tools had been applied, and more significantly, a single pale blue wool fiber caught in the curtain's twisted tassel. The same distinctive shade she had observed before, now appearing for the second time in connection with the hall's curtain mechanism. Most peculiar, she observed mildly to Dr. Redfern, who was completing his examination of Mrs. Lyle's minor injuries. Such quality fittings don't typically fail without cause. Dr. Redfern nodded grimly. The screws were deliberately loosened. Someone wanted this to fall, though whether they intended to harm Mrs. Lyle specifically or simply destroy evidence, I cannot say. Miss Bell, who had remained unusually quiet during this exchange, suddenly announced her intention to return home. Her face had gone quite pale, and Miss Marple noticed how carefully she avoided looking directly at the fallen curtain, as if the sight caused her genuine distress. Walking back through the gathering darkness, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. Julian's blackmail activities provided multiple motives for murder, but the second incident at the hall suggested something more troubling, a killer who was becoming increasingly desperate as the investigation progressed. The pale blue fiber, appearing now for the second time, spoke of someone who had been present at both incidents, someone with access to the hall, knowledge of its mechanisms, and the growing desperation that led to increasingly reckless attempts at concealment. That night, as Miss Marple sat in her parlor with her knitting, she received an unexpected visitor. Miss Bell appeared at her door with obvious reluctance, carrying a manila envelope that she handled as if it contained something distasteful. "I found this among Julian's music," she said without preamble, extending the envelope with trembling hands hidden inside his copy of Chopin's Nocturnes. "I thought perhaps someone should know what he really was." The documents inside painted a chilling picture of systematic exploitation. Julian had maintained meticulous records of what he termed his cultural development fund, complete with names, amounts, and detailed notes on each victim's particular vulnerability. The scope of his operations was broader than anyone had imagined, extending beyond St. Mary Me to neighboring communities, where his reputation as a cultural director provided perfect cover for his true activities. He was planning to leave, Miss Bell explained quietly, after one final collection from his current sources. He spoke of London opportunities of theatrical connections that could advance his career. But first, he intended to secure what he called adequate capitalization from those who had already invested in his vision. Miss Marple studied the documents with growing understanding. Julian's death had not been the result of sudden passion, but the desperate act of someone who faced exposure and ruin. The killer was someone whose name appeared in these carefully maintained records, someone who had paid Julian's price, but could no longer afford the escalating demands. As Miss Bell prepared to leave, she made one final observation that would prove crucial to Miss Marple's understanding of the case. "He was expecting someone that evening," she explained quietly. "During our conversation at 6 May, he kept checking his watch, saying he had another appointment at 6:30 with someone to discuss their continued commitment to his cultural projects." The pattern was now clear in Miss Marple's experienced mind. Julian's assassin was someone who had arranged to meet him privately, used that meeting to permanently silence him, and was now desperately attempting to destroy any evidence linking them to his blackmail activities. The pale blue fiber was no longer merely a clue. It was a signature left by someone whose carefully maintained respectability was fraying like the curtains that had hidden their crime. The morning after the curtain incident, Inspector Slack returned to St. Mary's with renewed determination and barely concealed frustration. His neat case against Colonel Hart had developed inconvenient complications, and the deliberate sabotage of the curtain mechanism indicated a killer growing increasingly desperate to destroy evidence. Miss Marple, observing his arrival from her cottage window with her usual quiet attention, noticed the specific set of his shoulders that indicated a professional confidence under siege. She discovered him in the village hall, examining the scattered brass fittings, with the methodical frustration of someone whose evidence refused to cooperate. The fallen curtain lay in its heap of rich velvet, the deliberate nature of its sabotage visible even to untrained eyes, while the remaining curtain hung silently as a witness to both crimes. "Most peculiar business," Inspector Slack muttered, not pleased to see Miss Marple approaching with her knitting bag and gentle expression of concern. "Someone's trying very hard to destroy evidence, which suggests our killer isn't as confident as we might have supposed." Miss Marple sat down in a chair with the ease of someone who had been prepared for a long period of observation. "Perhaps," she said mildly, "they're attempting to eliminate something specific rather than evidence in general. The curtains themselves might hold particular significance for someone." This observation prompted Inspector Slack to arrange a formal re-examination of witness statements, gathering those individuals whose names had appeared in Julian's blackmail ledger. The afternoon session revealed subtle inconsistencies that painted a picture of carefully constructed deceptions beneath the surface of village respectability. Patterns in deception. Mrs. Hart's testimony, delivered with nervous precision, placed her husband at doctor. Redfern's surgery from 4:30 until 5:45, followed by their punctual arrival at the hall. Yet when pressed for specific details about their conversation with the doctor, her responses became vague and contradictory. Most tellingly, she seemed unable to look directly at the stage area where the curtains had hung, her eyes sliding away whenever her gaze approached the velvet drapes, as if the sight caused physical discomfort. Dr. Redford himself provided corroboration that was perhaps too detailed, his medical training evident in the precise timing he offered. "The Colonel was quite agitated during our discussion," he explained with professional composure, concerned about village finances, the cost of improvements, whether certain expenditures were properly justified. Yet Miss Marple noted how his hands showed recent scratches consistent with handling rough metal, and his usual composed demeanor carried an underlying tension that suggested secrets carefully maintained. Miss Bell's behavior proved equally revealing under careful scrutiny. Her return to retrieve the metronome at 6:15 had been mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought. Yet her description of the hall's condition during that visit contained details suggesting more extensive familiarity with the backstage area than a simple piano bench visit would provide. When asked how she knew Mr. Ponsonby's security habits so intimately, she became flustered and claimed general village knowledge. Most significantly, Miss Bell had developed a pronounced tendency to position herself with her back to the stage whenever she entered the hall, as if the curtained area held associations too painful for direct contemplation. Her cream cardigan remained buttoned high, despite increasingly warm weather, and Miss Marple observed fresh evidence of strain around her fingertips, the sort of marks that thin cord might leave when wound tightly and pulled with desperate force. The art of observation. Miss Marple watched faces as Inspector Slack conducted his methodical questioning, noting not what people said, but what they avoided saying, not where they looked, but where they carefully did not look. Mr. Creswell maintained near-compulsive vigilance over the remaining hardware, his eyes returning repeatedly to the intact right-side fittings, like a man checking the pulse of a sleeping child. His professional pride had been wounded by suggestions of mechanical failure, yet his defensive explanations revealed knowledge that extended beyond simple installation. Surgeon's knots he had mentioned when describing quick-release techniques, then flushed at the medical terminology. Only a term, mind you. Any draper knows the double throw on the first pass gives you control of the exact moment of release. This detail resonated with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the crime's mechanics. Someone had needed precise control over timing, those crucial seconds when audience attention focused on ceremony, while a hand tugged a cord and a throat constricted. The altered tieback she had observed with its utilitarian knot replacing Creswell's decorative bow spoke of someone familiar with practical applications rather than aesthetic considerations. Evidence from unexpected sources. A visit to Bulldog and Fry's hardware shop provided additional pieces to the puzzle. Mr. Bulldog consulted his meticulous records with the solemnity of a ship's log, confirming Mrs. Forres's purchase of strongest gauge picture wire on the afternoon of the recital. More intriguingly, he revealed another purchase from the previous week. Medium gauge wire paid for in cash by someone he described as not local Neat Hands London voice, perhaps that artistic young fellow's supplier. Between these entries lay a purchase that caught Miss Marple's particular attention, a small tin of jeweler's rouge and a fine file. For polishing and smoothing burrs, Bold explained. Not half as good as beeswax on cords, mind, but useful if you've scratched your brass and want to pretend you haven't. The buyer had been a lady, gloves on, didn't take them off. This detail suggested someone who understood that tampering with the curtain mechanism would leave telltale marks on the brass fittings and who had prepared in advance to conceal such evidence. The methodical nature of the preparation spoke of calculation rather than passion, desperation rather than sudden impulse, behavioral revelations. The pattern that emerged from Miss Marple's careful observations was of a community where several individuals possessed both motive and opportunity, but where one person's behavior stood apart in its calculated misdirection. This individual had positioned themselves to provide information that seemed helpful, while actually obscuring crucial details, had established alibis that appeared solid while containing subtle flaws, and most tellingly, had demonstrated knowledge of the crime scene that exceeded what their stated involvement would suggest. The pale blue fiber, appearing at both the original murder scene and the subsequent sabotage, belonged to someone whose access to the hall was so routine that their presence would never be questioned. Yet their financial or personal circumstances had made them vulnerable to Julian's particular form of exploitation, creating the desperate circumstances that led to murder. During the evening service at St. Mary's, Miss Marple observed further telling details. Mrs. Hart knelt with impeccable posture, but did not look toward the chancel curtains when the Vijay tugged them aside, her gaze remaining fixed on her prayer book, as if it contained salvation. Dr. Redfern watched the same movement with a quick measuring glance before shuttering his eyes and practiced neutrality. Miss Bell sang softly with her head inclined, avoiding any sight lines that might include fabric or cord mechanisms. The pattern emerges walking home through the gathering dusk. Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of guilt and its manifestations. Those who could not look at curtains at all were either guilty or wounded by association. Those who glanced and turned away recognized mechanics as much as murder. Those who stared defiantly were fighting a different battle against humiliation, perhaps, or the fear of being disbelieved. The real killer, she now understood with growing certainty, was someone who had killed not in passion, but in calculated desperation. Someone whose respectability was so carefully maintained that exposure would mean complete ruin. They had used their intimate knowledge of village routines and the hall's layout to create what should have been the perfect crime, hidden behind curtains that were meant to symbolize cultural elevation, but had instead concealed the most sordid of human motivations. The murderer had possessed both the technical knowledge to manipulate the curtain mechanism and the psychological insight to predict exactly when all attention would be focused elsewhere. Most importantly, they had demonstrated the cold-blooded calculation necessary to return and attempt to destroy evidence, even at the risk of harming an innocent person. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would arrange a small domestic experiment, a matter of cords and tassels and questions asked in passing. People often betrayed themselves not through confessions, but through the way their fingers remembered forbidden actions, the way their eyes avoided guilty knowledge, the way their carefully constructed facades cracked under the gentlest pressure. The final curtain was about to rise on the truth, and Miss Marple, ever the patient observer of human nature, was ready to reveal what had been hidden in plain sight all along. The morning following her evening observations at St. Mary's brought Miss Marple to a decision that had been crystallizing through several sleepless hours of careful thought. The pattern was now clear in her mind, but patterns like delicate lace required proper handling to reveal their true design. She would need to create circumstances that would compel the truth to emerge naturally. Without the harsh confrontation that might drive guilt deeper into concealment, her opportunity arrived in the guise of a delicate suggestion to Mrs. Lai to test the remaining curtain mechanism before Sunday's memorial ceremony. Miss Marple remarked over morning tea how comforting it would be to know that everything works correctly, following dear Mrs. Lyle's terrifying ordeal with the falling curtain. We would not want any more disasters on such a grave event. Mrs. Lyle, still pale from her close encounter with the compromised gear, agreed quickly. Within an hour, she had called the key players. Mr. Creswell provided technological assistance, and Miss Bell practiced the memorial hymns. Dr. Redfern serves on the parish council, while Mrs. Hart is included out of politeness. Inspector Slack, after consulting to ensure propriety, gave permission for the modest assembly. Miss Marple arrived at the village hall early, carrying her knitting bag, and wearing the gentle expression of someone solely concerned with domestic matters. Her preparations, however, had been meticulous. She pulled from her luggage a length of thin cord, identical to that used in the curtain mechanism, as well as a spare tassel carefully selected from her own drawing-room curtains. The others assembled with the subdued punctuality that comes after a tragedy. Mr. Creswell gravitated toward his brass fittings with proprietary uneasiness, while Miss Bell positioned herself beside the piano, clutching her music case tightly. Mrs. Hart arrived with cautious precision, a pale blue cardigan buttoned high despite the rising morning temperature. Dr. Redfern maintained his professional demeanor, but his eyes showed the strain of recent events. Mrs. Lyle told everyone that there was nothing to worry about, despite the fact that her voice was still scratchy from being disturbed. Just a small test to ensure the memorial proceeds smoothly. Miss Marple nodded approvingly before making her crucial observation. It's only that one observes minor details, she observed with the air of someone commenting on weather patterns. For example, I believe one of the tassels on the tieback has gone away. Such a minor thing, but it affects how the cable hangs, and without adequate weight the device may operate unpredictably. Mr. Creswell, who had already examined the hardware, confirmed her observation with professional concern. Indeed, the left tassel has vanished completely. Most surprisingly, these do not simply fall off. Someone must have purposefully removed it. He knelt to examine the tieback more closely. A concealed screw beneath the silk cap requires a quarter turn counterclockwise, which is not something that happens by accident. Perhaps we could fashion a temporary replacement, Miss Marple suggested mildly, producing her spare tassel, just to thoroughly test the mechanism, though I must admit that I'm not sure how these things attach. She held up the length of cord she had brought, looking at it with the puzzled expression of someone encountering unfamiliar domestic equipment. I imagine the knot would need to be quite specific, something strong enough to support the weight, while also being manageable if adjustments were required. Miss Bell, who had been standing quietly near the piano, stepped forward with barely perceptible hesitation. I could try, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. One learns a variety of knots for securing music stands and such. Miss Marple's attention was immediately drawn to the cord, but her expression remained merely interested. Miss Bell's fingers, touching the thin material, began to tremble almost imperceptibly, as muscle memory overcame conscious control. Without conscious thought, she began forming a knot that was both practical and distinctive, a half-hitch with a double throw that spoke of familiarity rather than experiment. More tellingly, as she worked, she automatically wrapped the free end once around her index finger to draw the knot tight, a small unconscious action that caused her to flinch and quickly release the cord. The linear indentation Miss Marple had observed around her fingertips aligned perfectly with where the cord had pressed, and her breathing became shallow and controlled. Very capable, Miss Marple observed gently. Such practical knowledge is quite valuable, though I noticed you seem to find the cord rather uncomfortable to handle. Miss Bell's color had begun to drain from her face, leaving her eyes too dark against pale skin. "It's nothing," she managed. "Just the texture reminds me of something unpleasant." "Shall we test the mechanism?" Miss Marple suggested, moving toward the curtain with domestic efficiency. "Just a gentle draw, perhaps. Nothing dramatic, merely to ensure everything runs smoothly." She positioned herself where she could observe faces rather than hardware, then indicated the cord with a gentle nod. Miss Bell, standing nearest to the mechanism, reached for the line with visible reluctance. Her fingers found their grip with the unconscious precision that comes from recent practice, and when she began the pulling motion, she automatically compensated for the left roller's initial resistance with a subtle two-stage technique. At the first squeak of brass, she winced and altered her pressure instinctively, a small expert correction that spoke of intimate familiarity with this particular mechanism's quirks. It was the sort of knowledge one gained through repeated use, not casual observation. "That's quite enough," Miss Marple said quickly before the curtain could reveal more than a few inches of stage. "We mustn't overdo things. Thank you, my dear. You've given us all such confidence in the mechanism's reliability." Miss Bell stepped back from the cord as if it had burned her, her hands shaking visibly as she attempted to fold them calmly. The color had completely left her face, and her breathing had become rapid and shallow. Inspector Slack, who had been observing with professional interest, made a careful note. "Curious how some people have such natural aptitude for mechanical things," he observed, in a tone meant to sound casual, almost as if they'd had previous experience with similar equipment. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had been studying Miss Bell's reactions with the gentle attention she might apply to a sick bird. The pianist's inability to look directly at the curtain mechanism, her unconscious knowledge of its operation, the physical signs of stress when handling cord, all painted a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. Knowledge is such a curious thing, Miss Marple mused aloud, beginning to pack away her spare materials. Sometimes our hands remember what our minds would prefer to forget. Muscle memory, I believe they call it, the body's way of preserving experience, even when that experience is uncomfortable. Miss Bell's composure, maintained through sheer willpower since Julian's death, began to crack visibly. Her carefully controlled facade wavered like a candle flame in wind, and her eyes held the desperate look of someone who realizes their carefully constructed deceptions are crumbling beyond repair. "I think Miss Marple said with infinite gentleness that we should have a quiet conversation, my dear, just the two of us. There are things that need to be said, and secrets, I found, grow heavier the longer they're carried alone." The experiment had served its purpose with devastating effectiveness. Miss Bell's unconscious knowledge of the curtain mechanism, her physical reactions to handling cord, her instinctive familiarity with the exact techniques used in Julian's murder, all had been revealed through the simple expedient of asking her to demonstrate what she claimed not to know. As the others began to disperse, Miss Marple approached Miss Bell with the compassionate understanding that had served her well through countless human tragedies. The final revelation was now inevitable, but it would come, as truth always did in Miss Marple's experience, through gentle persistence rather than dramatic confrontation. The curtains had indeed hidden a secret, but now, like morning light through velvet drapes, the truth was finally ready to emerge from the shadows, where it had been so carefully concealed. The afternoon light in Miss Marple's drawing room held that crystalline quality that follows revelation, when secrets can no longer hide in shadows, and truth emerges with the inevitability of dawn. Miss Bell sat rigidly in the chintz armchair, her hands folded with desperate composure, while her eyes held the hollow look of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed beyond repair. Miss Marple poured tea with characteristic grace, the gentle ritual providing a moment's respite before the inevitable confrontation. The morning's experiment at the hall had served its purpose with devastating effectiveness, revealing not just guilt, but the specific knowledge that could only come from intimate, repeated contact with murder. "My dear," Miss Marple began softly, settling into her chair with her knitting, "I believe we both understand why we're here. Your hands remembered what your mind wished to forget, didn't they? The way that cord must be handled, the precise technique required to operate the curtain mechanism smoothly." Miss Bell's composure wavered like candlelight in a draught. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but the words carried no conviction. The pale blue fiber caught in the tassel, Miss Marple continued with infinite gentleness. "Matched your cardigan exactly, But more telling was your unconscious knowledge this morning. The way you compensated for the left roller's resistance, the automatic finger positioning to draw the knot tight. Such familiarity doesn't come from casual observation, does it? The confession that followed emerged in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror reflecting distorted truth. Julian had discovered Miss Bell's enhanced credentials, qualifications that existed more in aspiration than in fact, references that had been somewhat embellished when her mother's illness forced an abrupt departure from London. He called it cultural investment, Miss Bell said bitterly, her voice growing stronger with remembered outrage. But it was blackmail, pure and simple. Small payments at first, then larger sums as his ambitions expanded. He kept meticulous records, names, amounts, methods of persuasion. He was so proud of his systematic approach to what he termed educational philanthropy. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. During my nighttime visit, I retied the left tie back so that it would release quickly when pulled. Then I ran the wire through the curtain mechanism, around the roller, and back down to where Julian would be sitting. The technical execution had been precise and lethal. The wire, almost invisible against the dark velvet, had been set to tighten around Julian's throat when the curtain mechanism activated. The little delay in Mr. Creswell's trouble drawing the curtains was due to the wire reaching full tension. The applause covered any sound. Miss Bell continued, her voice barely audible. The velvet offered ideal concealment. By the time the curtains opened fully, he was already gone. I promptly disconnected the wire, washed the brass fittings clean, and assumed I had left no trace. Except for the fibre, Miss Marple remarked gently. And then your desperate attempt to remove the evidence by ruining the entire machine, which almost killed Mrs. Lyle. Miss Bell buried her face in her palms. When Inspector Slack turned his attention to the approach, I panicked. I assumed that if the entire installation seemed to be wrong, any remaining evidence would be discounted as coincidence. I never intended to harm anyone else. Miss Marple put down her needlework and leaned forward with loving understanding. Julian's blackmail network was quite vast, wasn't it? You were not his only victim. Miss Bell confirmed through tears that there were dozens of people spread throughout several areas. Teachers with enhanced credentials, shopkeepers with minor tax irregularities, the elderly with pension questions, small deceptions born of necessity that have evolved into systematic exploitation. He spoke of London opportunities and receiving large final payments before slipping into metropolitan oblivion. The revelation painted a picture of deliberate predation, disguised as cultural development. Julian's artistic pretensions had given ideal cover for a criminal operation that would have lasted endlessly, devastating lives and communities in pursuit of his goals. You killed him not only to protect yourself, Miss Marple noted calmly, but also to prevent all those other individuals from further exploitation. My dear, it was wrong, but not without honor. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Bell's confession came to a natural conclusion. The weight of her secret, carried alone through days of investigation and mounting fear, had finally found release in the gentle understanding of someone who had witnessed far too many human tragedies to pass harsh judgment. Miss Marple walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful village green, where children played blissfully unaware of the dark currents that flowed beneath their quiet lives. The curtains at the village hall remained hung, one repaired, both serving as silent reminders of what they had concealed. Inspector Slack will need to hear this, she finally replied, her voice full of anguish. But I believe he will understand that you were as much victim as perpetrator in this terrible affair. The truth had finally surfaced from behind the velvet veil. Not pretty, but necessary, and tinged with the tragic reality of how good people can be driven to desperate measures by impossible circumstances. The curtains that had concealed a corpse also concealed a story of systematic cruelty, as well as the ultimate rebellion of human dignity against planned exploitation. The silence that followed Miss Bell's confession carried the weight of revelation, as if the air in Miss Marple's drawing room had thickened with the gravity of finally speaking the truth. Inspector Slack, summoned by phone and arriving with his notebook and professional reserve, found himself witnessing the methodical unraveling of a seemingly simple crime that turned out to be devastatingly complex in human terms. Miss Marple put down her knitting and regarded the assembled company with the gentle authority that had guided her through countless such moments. Now that we know why, she suggested softly, we should look into how, not just for official reasons, but because the mechanics of this crime reveal as much about human nature as the motivations behind it. She rose and approached her esca, taking a length of thin cord and a small brass fitting from her own curtains. The murder weapon was not the wire, but the curtain mechanism, which had been transformed into a weapon of death. Miss Bell understood that the left roller could be used to create what amounted to a mechanical strangling device. With gentle precision, Miss Marple demonstrated how the wire had been threaded. During her 6-month visit to retrieve the metronome, Miss Bell discovered Mrs. Forrester's picture wire in the vest room, the strongest gauge available, as Mrs. Forrester had specified for her mirror. Miss Bell realized that this wire, nearly invisible against dark velvet, could be threaded through the curtain mechanism and positioned to form a noose at throat level for someone seated in the victim's customary chair. Inspector Slack watched intently as Miss Marple illustrated the technique. The practical knot replacing Mr. Creswell's decorative bow was crucial. A half-hitch with double throw, what sailors call a quick-release knot, allowed for instant removal of evidence once the deed was done. Miss Bell's father had been a merchant seaman, and such knowledge runs in families like recipes or lullabibbies. The technical aspects revealed themselves with chilling clarity. The wire had been carefully positioned to tighten when the curtain mechanism engaged, using the mechanical advantage of the brass roller to apply fatal pressure. The slight delay everyone had noticed, Mr. Creswell's difficulty in drawing the curtains, had been the wire reaching its full tension around Julian's throat. The timing was precise, Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone reconstructing a complex sequence. Miss Bell knew from countless rehearsals exactly when the curtains would be drawn. Mrs. Lye's speech, the ribbon cutting, the ceremonial count, all provided her with perfect knowledge of the crucial moment. Julian's punctuality and his habit of sitting in the same chair for optimal acoustics made him a predictable target. Miss Bell, pale but composed, added her own technical details with the precision of someone who had planned every aspect carefully. The applause masked any sound, she said quietly. The velvet offered ideal concealment. I removed the wire immediately after the curtains opened, wiped the brass fittings as best I could, and thought I had left no trace. But traces there were, Miss Marple observed gently. The pale blue fiber from your cardigan caught in the tassel during your preparations, the scratches on the brass where the wire had been attached and hastily removed. The altered knot that spoke of practical rather than decorative knowledge. Most tellingly, your unconscious familiarity with the mechanism's quirks. The way you compensated for the left roller's resistance this morning without thinking. The evidence formed a pattern as intricate as the lace Miss Marple favored in her needlework, each thread connected to others. The jeweler's rouge and fine file purchased by a gloved lady to smooth telltale scratches. The linear indentation around Miss Bell's finger from handling tight cord under pressure. Her inability to look directly at the curtains without visible distress. Miss Marple explained to Inspector Slack that Julian's blackmail operation was far more extensive than anyone had realized. His records, which were appropriately hidden in his sheet music, documented systematic exploitation in multiple villages. Teachers with improved credentials, shopkeepers with minor irregularities, and elderly residents with pension issues are all paying regular fees to maintain their reputations and livelihoods. The scope of Julian's activities revealed a pattern of calculated predation, masquerading as cultural development. His artistic pretensions had provided an ideal cover for criminal activity that would have continued indefinitely, destroying lives and communities in the pursuit of his metropolitan ambitions. Miss Marple observed that the missing wallet was a deliberate misdirection, removed to suggest robbery while concealing the true motive. But Julian's true wealth was not in cash, but in the vulnerabilities he had catalogued and exploited with business-like precision. Inspector Slack consulted his notes with increasing understanding. The second incident involved a sabotaged curtain that nearly injured Mrs. Lyle. Miss Bell admitted her desperation quietly. When I realized the police were looking into the method so closely, I assumed that if the entire installation appeared to be flawed, any remaining evidence would be dismissed as coincidental. The same pale blue fiber had betrayed me again. I was careless in my panic. Miss Marple nodded sadly. The tragedy was that Julian had genuine intelligence and talent. Applied legitimately, he might have achieved the cultural influence he claimed to seek. Instead, he chose to build his ambitions on the systematic destruction of others' peace and security. The pattern was now complete, every thread of evidence woven into a comprehensible whole, every seemingly random detail revealed as part of a larger, tragic design. The curtains, meant to bring dignity to their modest hall, had become instruments of concealment and death, hiding not just a corpse, but a story of systematic cruelty and the ultimate rebellion of human dignity against calculated exploitation. "What strikes me most," Miss Marple reflected as Inspector Slack prepared his official notes, "is how the most beautiful facades can conceal the darkest realities." Julian's cultural pretensions, the magnificent velvet curtains, even Miss Bell's composed demeanor, all served to hide truths that, once exposed, revealed the fragility of the lives we construct around our secrets. The mystery of the curtains that hid a corpse had been solved through careful observation of human nature, rather than forensic science, through understanding that people's hands remember what their minds would forget, and that guilt, like quality wool, leaves traces that patient eyes can detect. As the afternoon light faded toward evening, Miss Marple reflected that justice, like truth, often emerged not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small observations, each thread carefully examined until the complete pattern finally revealed itself in all its tragic complexity. The quiet that settled over Miss Marple's drawing room, following Miss Bell's confession, carried the weight of inevitable conclusion. Inspector Slack, summoned by telephone and arriving with professional efficiency, listened to the full account with the methodical attention that serious crimes demanded. Miss Bell's surrender was complete. No protests, no attempts at justification, merely the exhausted relief of someone whose carefully maintained facade had finally crumbled beyond repair. "I'll need you to come with me now, Miss Bell," Inspector Slack said gently, his usual brusqueness tempered by the circumstances. As they prepared to leave, Miss Bell turned to Miss Marple with a look of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding that desperation can drive good people to terrible choices." Miss Marple nodded with infinite compassion. "My dear, the tragedy is not that you were driven to it, but that someone so calculatingly cruel made it seem your only option." The wheels of justice. The legal proceedings unfolded with measured dignity over the following weeks. Miss Bell's barrister constructed a defense based on extreme provocation and diminished responsibility, presenting Julian's systematic blackmail as the driving force behind her desperate act. The extensive documentation found in Julian's lodgings revealed 17 victims across 4 villages. Their small deceptions transformed into systematic extortion by a young man whose artistic pretensions masked calculating greed. The judge, acknowledging the exceptional circumstances while maintaining the rule of law, sentenced Miss Bell to 12 years imprisonment. "The premeditation cannot be ignored," he observed. Yet the systematic cruelty that drove this defendant to such desperate measures represents a form of provocation that the law must recognize. Julian's blackmail records were handled with discretion by authorities who understood that justice sometimes required mercy toward the victims. Quiet arrangements were made, debts forgiven, reputations preserved, lives allowed to continue without the shadow of past mistakes magnified by criminal exploitation. Village Healing St. Mary processed the revelation with the particular resilience that small communities develop over generations of weathering scandal. The initial shock gave way to a complex mixture of sympathy for Miss Bell and retrospective condemnation of Julian, whose memory was quietly but thoroughly revised from cultural savior to calculating predator. Mrs. Forrester emerged from her ordeal with newfound purpose, quietly settling several outstanding debts in the community and resuming her charitable activities with less fanfare but greater genuine warmth. The magnificent curtains at the hall were professionally cleaned and rehung with modern safety fittings that prioritized function over ornate display. Colonel Hart, cleared of all suspicion, channeled his relief into pavilion repairs with military efficiency. His relationship with his wife, strained by the investigation's revelations, settled into a pattern of careful honesty that seemed to suit them both. Dr. Redfern resumed his rounds with renewed attention to the subtle anxieties beneath his patients' everyday complaints. Recognizing how unseen burdens could drive people to desperate acts, Mr. Creswell, his professional pride, wounded by association with the crime, initially considered relocating his business. However, the village's need for his expertise in restoring the hall's dignity gradually rebuilt his reputation. His new installations featured deliberately simple designs that emphasized safety over theatrical effect. Quiet transformations, the Village Improvement Committee, chastened by their experience with charismatic leadership, adopted more democratic procedures, requiring multiple approvals for significant expenditures. Cultural events continued under Miss Bell's replacement, Mr. Harwick, whose humble competence emphasized community participation over imported sophistication. The hall itself underwent subtle transformation. The stage was rearranged to eliminate the chair where Julian had died, and a small memorial plaque acknowledged his contributions to village cultural life without reference to the circumstances of his death. The curtains, when drawn for performances, moved smoothly on their new mechanisms, functional, safe, and free of the deadly associations that had made them instruments of concealment and death. Final reflections. As autumn settled over St. Mary, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of concealment and revelation during her evening constitutional past the village hall. The building stood peaceful in the gathering dusk, its windows glowing warmly where the sewing circle was meeting, the murmur of many hands working, and occasional bright ring of a dropped pin, creating the gentle soundtrack of community life resumed. The case had taught her that even the most carefully constructed deceptions eventually betrayed themselves through small inconsistencies, a fiber caught in silk, hands that remembered forbidden actions, eyes that could not look upon guilty knowledge without flinching. Human nature, like quality fabric, bore traces of every stress, every moment, when pressure exceeded what could be safely contained. People choose what to display and what to conceal, she murmured to herself. Much like curtains themselves, we draw them closed against prying eyes, then open them to welcome light. The tragedy occurs when what we hide in darkness grows too powerful for daylight to dispel. St. Mary had survived its encounter with systematic evil, emerging sadder, but perhaps wiser. The village hall stood ready to serve its community once again, its curtains now symbols of renewal rather than concealment. And Miss Marple, her understanding of human nature deepened by yet another tragic encounter with the darkness that could lurk beneath respectability's surface, prepared to face whatever mysteries the future might bring to her peaceful corner of England. The curtains that had hidden a corpse now hung as silent testimony to the truth that no secret, however carefully concealed, could ultimately escape the patient observation of those who understood that the most significant revelations often came disguised as the smallest details.